thrilled to have these four amazing women. They work as content architects and content designers at Intuit, and they identified a critical need within their organization and teamed up to solve it. And they're here tonight to share what they did and how they did it. I'm not going to introduce each one of them individually. I'll let them do that for themselves, but please welcome Sarah Mohs, Caitlin Halliburton, Jennifer Kennedy, and Nicole Baptista. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. I see some familiar faces in there. Hi, Natalie and Susan, Kelly. All right. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right thing. And then we will get started. Okay. So Paula gave us a little intro, but we can do a little intro about ourselves. We thought it would be kind of a fun icebreaker to talk about, or I guess not talk about, but name a favorite children's book. So I encourage everyone to drop your favorite children's book in the chat, get a nice collection going. I will start. My name is Sarah, and I work on the content strategy and systems team at Intuit. And what I do is manage the tools and processes that help the content designers here scale themselves in their work. So part of that is managing our style guide. I also manage our AI language checker and various other tools that help folks. And my favorite children's book is very hard, but I chose The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle because I just remember it's such a beautiful book. It's one that I always gift to any friends who are having babies. And it just feels good. Caitlin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Halliburton. I am a content designer on Mint, which is part of the consumer group in Intuit. I am also a member of the Indigenous Peoples ERG, one of the founding members. And this is hard for me too, but I think I'd have to go with The Velveteen Rabbit. I used to have a little pocket size edition, and I wore that book down so much I read it countless times. So I will pass it on to Nicole now.
Hey everybody, my name's Nicole, and I'm a senior content designer that works on our QuickBooks products on the brand and marketing side. And I also struggled like figuring out my favorite, but I think it's Love You Forever because when I read that, I still feel super emotional about it. So, and it's one of those that I give to everybody I know that has a baby. So with that, I'll pass it to Jennifer.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a senior content designer on Mint, leading the team on the product side. And my favorite, I took a turn for the Newbery Medal side of things. My favorite book is From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler by E.L. Konigsberg. I mean, who hasn't had the impulse to run away to the Metropolitan Museum? I have read that many, many times. Anyway, I'll have to check out in the chat everyone else's favorites. But to start us off tonight, we really wanted to open up the space with this quote. I've stopped saying the phrase, you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Instead, I tell people, use your discomfort to learn. And discomfort is really natural when we encounter something new. It signals an opportunity to learn and to grow. When we lead with curiosity and care for each other, discomfort is also temporary. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive in. To start us off, Caitlin is going to walk us through how this work got started. So Caitlin?
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, we got started. It was right after the murder of George Floyd, and there was riots across the country. Of course, that led to chatter amongst many subgroups across our company. And with many of us asking ourselves, what can we do? And we have to think back to our values as who we are, even as a company. We are stronger together. We care and give back. We want to be courageous and integrity without compromise. So as we're thinking that, we're thinking, so where are my strengths? where do I know I can do it? And as a team of writers, we know our strength is language and words. So I know I personally remember seeing somewhere in one of the many Slack groups that we're all a part of, saying, hey, who wants to be a part of a small team to tackle anti-racist language across the company? And so we signed up, and it was just a small team of us. But we really grounded ourselves in the discussion of, who we are, who we want to be as a company, and how we can spearhead that movement forward through anti-racist language. So now I think we're moving on.
Yeah, I'm going to just set a little more context, because I feel like context is always helpful. And I know that, whether you're a content strategist or content designer or copywriter, whatever writing capacity, excuse me, content sits in different places in different organizations. So just a little background about content at Intuit. The content design team sits within the design team, so it's centralized. And then we have designers who are embedded in the different products. So that's TurboTax, QuickBooks, Mint, ProConnect, all the different permeations of all of those that sit within. And then so you have many content designers who work in the product, and you have content designers who work in marketing, customer success, developer content, the Intuit platform. There's like a ton of different little areas, but everyone uses one main style guide, and that's contentdesign.intuit.com. And that's a public style guide, so you can go there. We have everything from when to capitalize stuff, at least Intuit, to how we talk about bad news. And the goal for this was to really create guardrails so that content folks can have the freedom to focus on like the heart of the message they're trying to convey, or think about the bigger picture rather than like, where does this comma go, or do I use title case or not? So one section that we've been focusing on has been our accessibility and inclusion section. So we have guidance about readability, accessibility principles, gender neutral language. And then, as Caitlin mentioned, one of the things that a lot of us were asking were, how do the words that we use help or harm people? And more specifically, we were thinking about, are there words at Intuit that we're using that are harming our customers and our colleagues? And so is the content that we are putting out there really reflecting those company values that Caitlin showed us earlier? And I know that like sometimes company values can seem like kind of fake and corporate-y, but I feel like Intuit does walk the walk as far as like we really do look at those values whenever we are making big decisions or creating things. So that's kind of a little bit of context about who we are and where we started. And so when we all got together, there's a content UX Slack, and there's a channel there, the anti-racist language channel. And I think there were a lot of people in the industry who were like, what do we do? What are the words? And we started a spreadsheet and just started identifying different words that had oppressive roots. And we kind of took that as our starting point and then ran with it. And we did a super quick audit, which is a good basis for any content project. And by quick, I mean, we didn't really like dig in at all. It's more like we took like a little spade and started like poking at the surface of, what's here? Like the products are so vast. How do we get this started? And so we assembled the team. We all kind of looked around our areas to see where words like master or grandfathered showed up. And we didn't spend too long on this, but we did find a lot of stuff. And so these are some of the examples of customer-facing instances of exclusionary language in things like, here's TurboTax support content. There's QuickBooks login stuff, like user settings. It's in the dashboard in QuickBooks. It's on the website. It's in customer success content, support content. So this is just a few areas, and you could find it everywhere. So we're like, oh, we need to do something about this. And I know I'm probably breaking some rule by showing a screenshot of a spreadsheet, but hear me out. Spreadsheets can be beautiful things, and this one was really helpful. So I think when we're talking about really big projects like this, it can feel really overwhelming, and maybe that's how you feel too if you're trying to get this started where you are working. Because after all, we weren't in leadership positions. We aren't developers who can go into the code and swap words out. I don't even know if it's that easy. We didn't know how to change the terms. We were really just kind of feeling our way into this. And so we just wanted to do something, and it's kind of like goal setting. So at Intuit, we have these personal and professional goals that we set every year. And I was thinking about this today because we have to break those big goals down into smaller actionable steps. And then we track that throughout the year to be am I going to make my goal? And sometimes it can be a headache, but it is really useful to see a big goal broken down that way. And so that's what we did here. We noted who we talked to, who we wanted to talk to, asked them who we should talk to, from HR to our employee resource groups to PD executives, developers. Once we started doing that, the ball got rolling pretty quickly. And Jennifer's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Sarah. So once we had kind of benchmarked against other companies, saying what they were doing, as well as auditing our products internally, we knew we had to share our word list with other Intuit content folks. And this was really probably the most important step because it led to a critical realization. During our first forum with our fellow content professionals, one of our teammates, Martina, noticed that the group was really intellectualizing the discussion. And I'm sure this group is familiar with the phenomenon. When you get word people together, it's easy to start talking about grammar and etymology and so forth. And those things are, in addition to being really fun, are super important. They can contribute a lot to these discussions. But in this case, what we discovered was that they really placed the focus on technical nuance and away from people. And that was a wake-up call for the whole team because it was the opposite of what we had set out to do. So we did something else that content designers and strategists often do, and that is we defined principles to help guide these discussions. And they really became the backbone of what became our guidelines. Content principles really account for the fact that we're never going to document every harmful word that crops up. Instead, principles really ground us in what's important. And it keeps us honest with ourselves and our partners. Because ultimately, it's not about the words themselves. It's about the way that the words can make people feel. And that's why our first principle is that people come first. Our principles also give us a framework with which to scale. We didn't set out to be 24/7 like language police. And not only is it not feasible, it's not our mission because it's not about being prescriptive. It's about offering a tool to help people to be more mindful with their communication. Then they can decide for themselves whether a specific word's impact matches the intent of what they want to say. And so that's how things started. Next, Nicole is going to tell us about how things are going today.
Thanks, Jen. And Sarah, oh, perfect. So I'm going to talk about how it's been going and the progress that we've made. And one of our biggest successes so far is replacing master with primary across all of our QuickBooks products. And these include our online services as well as our desktop products. This effort wasn't something that we did overnight, and it took a long time, actually. For QuickBooks Online, it took about 6 months, and we're still working on QuickBooks Desktop. Many GitHub repositories are owned by different teams at Intuit, so the process was more of a marathon than a sprint for sure. And the word master is problematic for obvious reasons, and it's one of the most important to change because it shows up just about everywhere. It shows up in our product, in our help content, in our engineering code and documentation. So far, we've updated 289 instances of master admin to primary admin. Another term that popped up in our messaging was white glove. We use this term to describe one of our QuickBooks payroll onboarding features. White glove feels a little less obvious. It's a marketing term that's commonly used to describe top tier support, but the term actually refers to the gloves worn by people in service. Most importantly, it has ties to minstrel shows, which were an American form of racist entertainment developed in the early 19th century. So after pinpointing why white glove was problematic, we knew we needed to rename our payroll feature and make sure that we stopped using it everywhere. Digging a little deeper, we also found out that customers don't even understand what it means to begin with. It was confusing and felt like marketing jargon. So this gave us even more rationale when we started having conversations with the people we worked with. Making changes like this is not easy. Like master admin, it took months, a lot of work and cross-functional partnership, but most importantly, it took open, honest conversations about the importance of language and the work we've been doing to create Intuit's anti-racist guidelines. We did a lot to make this change happen, and sometimes it forced us to have uncomfortable conversations, and that's part of the process. But eventually we were able to update 35 instances on web, 17 in product, and a whopping 454 in code. And that brings me to, expanding our guidance. So we started a word list to call out terms with racist roots at first, terms that we wanted to move away from it into it. The list is evolving, but by no means exhaustive. Since its creation, we've moved beyond anti-Black terms to include words and phrases that have a further reach. The list was created to give people context and offer alternate words and phrases that people can use instead. In every case, these suggestions are simpler, cleaner, and more meaningful. Words on our list don't necessarily show up in our product code or marketing either. Like the term brown bag. At Intuit, you'll see brown bag used to describe lunchtime meetings. This term actually refers to interracial discrimination from the segregation era. Why not just say lunch and learn or lunch meeting instead? We also added words and phrases that people use in everyday conversation, like tribe, spirit animal, and hold down the fort. Did you know that hold down the fort originated from settlers and soldiers who built forts in and on indigenous lands to forcibly claim and colonize them? When you know more, you can do better. Many of us evoke racism when we use phrases like this without even knowing it. Like we said earlier, we aren't the language police, but we're dedicated to creating tools to help everyone write content that's inclusive. Now I'll hand it over to Sarah, who will talk about other tools we use to tackle the same problem.
Yes. Okay. So, we have the guidelines on our site, which is great. But, there are definitely other areas where people aren't using inclusive language, and we can't force everyone to go to a browser and go to our guidelines and have them up all the time. And so one thing that came out of our work was two engineers came to us for a hackathon, and they wanted to create a bot because they were really worried. They wanted to use inclusive language. They didn't want to harm anyone by using the wrong words, but they couldn't always remember which words to use. And they didn't have the style guide up all the time. They didn't want to say anything that might cause harm or be a microaggression. So we partnered with them to run a pilot with a bot built in Slack. And we also partnered with Writer, which is an AI language checker that we use. We got to use their API and manage our terms in their bank. And the goal was that if you were typing something in a channel and you said something that was on our terms list, the bot would scan it and then it would reply privately to you saying hey, we champion inclusion. That includes the words we use. It would highlight the word, and then it would explain why the word was harmful and then offer some alternatives. And so the goal for this bot was to be a teaching tool around harmful language while not calling anyone out publicly. So it responded privately. You can see in the top, it had the terms that we had on our terms list, like master, whitelist, blacklist, grandfathered. But then it also had terms that were just non-inclusive more generally. So whether it was mental health or hey guys, which is something that I always say, like these things are things that I'm still trying to unlearn. And I don't always get it right. I think a lot of us don't always get it right. But the point is now when I say that, I catch myself. And so I try to correct myself, whereas I wouldn't have noticed it before. So we were really proud that the bot was added in almost 700 Slack channels. And it scanned thousands and thousands of words, almost 40,000 a day. And what we were able to see, some metrics, not necessarily like the words themselves or like any data about the people, but it was just how many times the bot was sending messages. And it was kind of the great metric where it's actually going down. And so what that was telling us is that people were learning. And so we actually don't want the bot to respond all the time. We don't want it to be flagging language. It's great when people aren't using that language to begin with. So that's just another way that we have tried to bring inclusive language to Intuit. And I had mentioned Writer earlier, and that's another tool that we use. So it's an AI language checker, and it has a Chrome extension and a Figma plugin that checks language where you write. So we are able to kind of port our style guide from what's on the website and incorporate it into a checker that just shows up in Google Docs or wherever. So and it flags inclusivity. You can see right here, it has our terms, it has our style, but then it does have inclusivity there as well. And it checks sex and gender, family status, disability, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, that kind of stuff. So that's been really helpful. And I think having these checks in multiple places, both where content is created for work and then also where conversations are happening at work, helps reinforce that inclusive language isn't something that we should just be turning on or off. It's not something that's just for customer facing content. It's something that we should always be using no matter who we're talking to. And this one is beyond Intuit. The more we talked about this at work and the more that teams knew about it, the more they were applying it to their spaces. So, for example, PMs use AHA to manage product roadmaps, and they had noticed that there was a master feature name. And so they, brought it to leadership, and then leadership made noise about it. And I'm not saying that like Intuit was the reason why they changed it. They were already making plans to change it, but they fast-tracked making that change to principal feature name instead, which is great. And then another legal compliance and policy, which not normally a group that, actually I won't say anything about that, but they changed their non-inclusive, there's a vendor and they changed their non-inclusive language because our organization showed them our guidelines, which is pretty great. And not like sharing this to humble brag or anything. I think it's been really inspiring to see all these other teams be inspired to create their own guidelines and start conversations, and just so amazed at how much this work has affected others, and we hope it inspires you. And so I think we have some pointers on how you can get started, and Caitlin will cover.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So first, we always want to push for simple, clear content. And we all know as people who work within the content realm, whether we're strategists, architects, designers, managers, whatever it is, it's important for us to champion content. And I'm sure all of you have experienced having stakeholders, maybe they're marketers, maybe they're product managers, whoever they are, who don't often understand why we push for clarity and emotion, because they're so attached to trying to reach a certain metric. So with that, we advise you to always have your voice and tone principles and brand attributes on hand to use as your proof to say, hey, we're trying to be clear, we're trying to be concise, we're trying to use words that make people feel at least positively, whatever that may be. So this is what we want to stick to. And that's why it's important to explain what we're doing and why we need clear, concise, accurate, and inclusive content wherever you may work. And not to mention, we already know that simple and clear content, just by the examples, Nicole provided above with white glove and brown bag and other terms, that clear content is more accessible, it's open and inclusive, and it benefits literally everyone. So a good resource that we can link you to is Sarah Winter's Accessibility Guidelines. It's a platform where she tried to develop a universal content style guide based on usability evidence. So we already know that clear content works, and why not keep pushing for it? Next thing you can do is don't wait to be assigned something. We went over a little bit earlier how we got started, and nobody asked us to do this. We know that leadership was on board at some point. Theoretically, they were on board, but nobody told us, hey, this is what we want you guys to do. We just knew that we wanted to be inclusive. We knew that we wanted to champion language and make sure that our language reflected our values as a company, and individually as well. So don't wait to be assigned something. You never know where it might lead and who might be on board. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Nicole.
Thanks. And, on that note, I will say I joined this group of wonderful women because someone pinged me that white glove was showing up in the space that I worked in. And so, to this point of just diving into the work, that's kind of what I did. And I'm so glad I did, because I have found a group of people to do the work that is so meaningful for me and that I think is really, really important. But it all started with me just saying, okay, let's figure out how to get started. And when I did that, it was, there wasn't really a process for that type of work, as we've mentioned earlier. So I think we've all figured out how to do this along the way. And so first, for me, it was important to do as much research as possible before having conversations with the people that I needed to push to get things changed. And some of that research included internal audits, competitor analysis, listening to customer feedback, looking through reports and surveys, and talking to a lot of my peers. And next, I needed to find people that would help me. And they are out there. Even when you feel like they're not, they are. You just keep asking. So we started, presenting our findings to marketing partners and product designers, leadership, customer success teams, legal teams. And that's just to name a few. And by doing that, it got the conversation going, and it also, built this rationale where people really believed in the thing that we were doing. We knew developers would also play a huge role in getting content updated on web, product, and in code. So we provided as much documentation as possible. So when it was time to make updates, they had what they needed. And, the point there being is we learned that there isn't one way to do anything. This is just the way that we did this. So now I'm going to hand it off to Jen to talk more about the process.
Thanks, Nicole. So before, during, and after you start this process, you may be expecting a roaring, unanimous consensus in response to your efforts. And maybe you'll get it. That's the writer's dream, right? But odds are you're going to hear some negative feedback at some point, and that ain't easy. But we're here to tell you, keep going. Even at an organization like Intuit, where inclusion and diversity are company values endorsed at the very highest levels, we still encountered moments of hesitation and resistance while you're trying to make these changes, because change is hard. But stay the course. Inclusion really does benefit everyone and everything, including the bottom line. You want your product to be clear, simple, and precise. As Caitlin and Nicole were both describing, inclusive content does that. And even though there will be people who don't agree with you, there will be many others who do. The open conversations that we've been able to have and be a part of, and also just hearing from customers, business partners, and coworkers who really felt empowered to have those conversations on their own, it's just so rewarding. And then there's one more note I'll leave us on before we head to Q&A. And that is, building inclusion is not a 2-week sprint. When you're dealing with words and mindsets that are really embedded in our culture, there's a lot of unlearning and relearning to do. That means that a lot of your effort is going to be groundwork. It could be years to fully come to fruition or see the complete outcome. But the upside is you're making a lasting impact. So stay committed. You got this. And with that, I guess we'll head over to Q&A.
Great, thanks everybody. Yeah, we've got a pretty good queue of questions lining up here. I'm just going to go through them in order. Go back up to, sorry, I have to scroll back a little bit. Ariel had a question about how do you find all these instances of the words you want to replace? I think that was around the example of the white glove example, I think, when you cited the numbers.
Oh yeah, I can cover that. So at first we had no idea because Intuit is a over 30-year-old company and our code base is huge, and they call it the monolith. I didn't even know how to get started doing that. So we asked around and we actually got to work with the localization team that had access to the GitHub repos. And so they were able to search the code and find those things, and they were able to log Jira tickets and replace stuff that way. So that was like a little unexpected way that we were able to work with localization to replace those things.
That's cool. I love that localization helped you out like that. Join the team.
Yeah.
I actually did a bunch of research on that for a talk I recently did, and repurposing of localization software was like the most popular way to deal with strings. So, yeah. And Sarah, you posted something in the chat, and I want to kind of rephrase it as a question. You said you'd received some pushback about metrics, and we tell them that for this work, humans are the KPIs, not metrics. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I can give an example. We've had some people be like, how do you know, why are you spending time on this? This isn't something that is going to boost our subscription rates, or there's no hard numbers we can attach to this work. And I point them to, there's an email that an employee sent to Sasan, our CEO. And he said, as a descendant of Black slaves, the word master and master admin has always felt uncomfortable to me. And I'm so glad that something is finally being done about it. And there was also some chat on Twitter of customers being like, why is this still a thing? And so when we point to the people, our first principle is people come first, not numbers or metrics. It's people. And if one person feels more included because of a change in language that makes a term clearer to begin with, then that's a success. It's not did we boost subscription rates or anything like that.
Cool, thanks. And then Kelly had two questions, and we'll ask each of these separately. First question is, when developing inclusive language guidelines for a business, how can we make sure that we're getting a well-rounded perspective, especially when the company is small? Even with group participation from anonymous write-in polls, there's not many diverse perspectives represented.
I'll take that one. Well, for us, we are a large company, so it was very easy for us to reach out to our employee resource groups, different managers of different realms of Intuit, and talk to them about it and get those employee resource groups together. We've done events with the African American Ancestry Network, the Latinos Network, the Indigenous Peoples Network, and so forth. But for a smaller company, I would have to say that, try to reach out to a broader network. This is the age of social media. This is the age of the internet, where on LinkedIn or something like that, you can connect with a more diverse group of people who still work within your realm or work outside of it, whatever it is that you can connect with and just find people to talk to. And you will be surprised how many people would love to have someone ask them about this and have these conversations from diverse ethnic backgrounds. So I guess it goes back to our quote that we started with. You got to step outside your comfort zone.
Yeah. Did anybody else want to chime in on that one? Or? Okay. And Kelly had a second question. What's a good response to someone who feels defensive or angry at making these types of changes? That is, if they feel called out or attacked for not having made the change earlier.
I feel like I can kind of chime in, and then Sarah, I don't know if you want to too, but in my experience, I just continued to provide the rationale, because I did experience that, and it was direct, and it was, wouldn't say angry, but it was definitely not understood like what the point of this work was, and it wasn't friendly. And I just, it wasn't about me saying, well, you need to understand this work. I kind of looked at it like, this work is happening. This is part of our company's value system. Like, I'm providing context for you and to jump on board. But I wasn't having conversations around getting permission necessarily. I was just finding the correct people. And so if that wasn't the person that was to help, then I found somebody else, because at the end of the day, this is like super important work. And I think we'll always run into that. I don't know if anybody else wanted to provide any other experiences.
I can add a little bit to that. And it's maybe less about the response after the fact, but also just approaching it before that happens, like in terms of how do you address word choices that you're like, oh, that's kind of maybe not as inclusive as it could be. And I've found that a really successful or helpful way to go about it is just leading with inquiry and just asking like why that particular word choice, or like, what do you think that means? Or how do you think that's landing with others? And just offering that opportunity to others to be introspective and reflective about their word choice. Cause that's really what we want folks to do at the end of the day, is just to be mindful.
Nice.
And also to just remember that, yeah, not everyone will be on board, and everyone is learning. And we've had to have these conversations amongst ourselves when we receive that kind of pushback, is just remind ourselves that everyone's at a different journey in their growth. And I mean, you can't win them all. Not to take it personally.
And I will say one more thing. I think something that helped me too was providing as much, like gathering, and we mentioned in the presentation, but just gathering as much rationale as possible. So not only is it about being inclusive, but it's about like being of service to our customers. Like at the end of the day, they're the ones that matter. People matter. And so if you just kind of focus it on more than one thing, I have found that to be incredibly useful.
Nice. Bridget had a question, says, we all have a part to play in creating an inclusive culture, but when is it better to step back and elevate other voices in that discussion?
I don't know that I have an answer for like exactly when. I think it's definitely, when we were creating these guidelines, we have two people on our team who aren't here, but making sure that as many voices as possible are being heard. So like Caitlin mentioned, we did talk to a lot of employee resource groups, a lot of other content designers. So I also want to open it up, like if anyone else here has stuff that they want to say too, like this can be a conversation with all of us. It doesn't just have to be us answering the questions, because I know there are some other people in here who have a lot of experience as well. Caitlin, you're off mute. Did you want to say something too?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I don't know either, but I do know that if you create the opportunity and just be mindful of creating the opportunity, then there will be people who will share and will appreciate that, and just having the grace to listen.
And also seeing like who's in the room with you and when these conversations are happening, and are they speaking up? How can you use your privilege to lift other voices, and just make sure that they're also being heard? Like who's on the decision-making teams, like, or what meetings are you in? How can you bring other more diverse voices in?
And I'll plus one on that. I've recently been on a project that's focused on DEI and kind of redesigning our careers page, and noticed in the kickoff that it was all women and they were all white. And so immediately it was just like, how can we bring in other people with lived experiences that are different? And I mean, it was the first thing that came to mind, but knowing exactly how to do that is not necessarily the answer that I have, but it's definitely, reaching out and trying to get as much feedback or participation as possible, because that's what matters.
And Larry Asher, the other Larry on the call, had a question. The tools you shared are great for catching suspect words, but how do you test an entire experience, the flow, images, words, audio, etc., to look for red flags? And is it okay to use red flags?
Have a content designer working on the experience. Yeah, I mean, we had those tools in place to help like guide people and create and help people learn. But like if there's a content designer on, like they should know about readability and accessibility. Like this is what we do every day. So as far as testing for the entire experience, it's like making sure a content designer is there from the beginning and is writing this content and testing it. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to add.
I was just going to say, just to kind of get to the question that Larry had about how do you go through an entire site full of content. There's the way of going into the code, which you guys explained, which is awesome. And then there's also the good old content audit, which can be quite an arduous task, but it is one possible way of wrapping your head around all the content that you have.
If folks don't know, Paula is like probably the leading voice in content auditing in the profession. I'm just wondering if, and not to put you on the spot, Paula, but I'm just wondering if this has come up in any of your auditing work.
No, it hasn't, and I'm just drinking all this in and thinking about that in terms of So, thank you for mentioning that. I'm actually working on a second edition of my book on doing content audits, and I'm making a note to myself that this is in the time that the first edition came out in 2014. So. Obviously a lot has happened in 7 years in terms of people's, awareness of language and these sorts of issues. So, so this is great for me to be thinking about, in terms of like, what would that look like to include that language as part of an audit process. And so, it's good to know kind of what tools are available, but, as Ariel said, and Larry said, I mean, sometimes there's just no substitute for just reading it, right? And just going through it all bit by bit and, kind of getting that, really broad horizontal view of everything that you have. And, which is why I think sometimes the people who do content audits know more about their content than anyone else in the organization, because they're one of the, it's not that common that you get, that any one person is looking across everything. So this is really, it's definitely something that I want to think about and maybe circle back with our speakers when I kind of get to that point. I'm thinking about that for the book.
Also, I want to add, I have a background in video games, and especially as you're driving to content complete and ship, and also dealing with localization. One of the things, and also the entertainment software ratings board, one of the things we found really, really helpful was to disseminate this type of information to the test team, or in the other case of a product, the engineering org, because they're, they're engaging with the product even, sometimes on deeper levels than what I'm seeing, as it's being prototyped or, whatever. And, we would set up trainings with them and collaborate with them and just have open discussions regularly on products. And we found it like super, super helpful. It improved our ESRB handoffs, and we made things more equitable for people. And we also caught a lot of errors. Like they're widely on video games and people like to try and sneak, things in. And so you really need a lot of eyes on it. It can't just be, a small content team.
And the next question actually is from Paula in the Slack. Curious as to whether you've heard feedback, positive or negative, from customers in addition to internal people.
Nicole, do you want to share your testing stuff about White Glove?
I mean, yeah, that's definitely a good example. In changing White Glove, we did 2 different rounds of testing, and so we heard a lot of direct, customer feedback. And in that testing, it wasn't like known as, we're changing one term to another, but just like the clarity around changing something that felt so jargony to expert review people. We're on board immediately. So it's just kind of interesting to find something that has oppressive roots and then to have so much customer feedback be so positive around something because they simply understand it. So it's not just changing something because it's hurtful, but it's also changing something to be just so much more clear. So it's definitely 2 birds with 1 stone. That's like my biggest example of testing or getting feedback that way, but not sure if anybody else has any other examples they'd like to share.
No, that's interesting to me, Nicole. Sorry, I just want to say, because there's so many other examples of accessibility and inclusion issues benefiting a larger audience. Is that a common pattern?
Can you say that one more? So accessibility issues.
Sorry, it's a common story, like the curb cut example for accessibility and how that benefits, delivery drivers and other people as well. And what you just said makes me wonder if there's a similar dynamic with inclusive language and accessible language, having, not only addressing the immediate concern, but also benefiting other people.
I mean, I think so. I see Sarah nodding her head, but
I'm just thinking of translation and localization. Like these terms are like, they don't make any sense, and they're rooted, a lot of them, in like Western idioms, and they just aren't clear. So if anything can be clearer, it's better for everyone, including non-native English speakers.
Yeah, and also to add to that, we have so many customers from all over, all walks of life, and when you're writing content for everybody, people who maybe don't have speak English as a learned language is another example, where using that kind of idiomatic language is just not accessible to them, or it's not easily understood. And if it takes you, you have to Google the meaning of something to understand my product, I didn't do a very good job,
And those colloquialisms are also like rooted in socioeconomic. Like White Glove is a perfect example of classism too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually I remember one of our VPs slacked me once and was like, so what's the deal with whitelist? Like how does that kind of land with you? Like, give me some feedback. And I was just kind of like, I have to really stop and think about that. And I know, like, I've talked to other like more early career folks as well, and they're just like, what does that even mean? Like if I'm just entering the workforce is another example. Like I don't have that kind of corporate background to understand the meaning, and surely there's another word that can communicate the same thing more expediently and efficiently. So that was kind of my feedback. I think we landed on something like custom branding or something along those lines, but yeah.
I also think the tech space is a big offender of using words that nobody understands anyway. So
it's just a bit gatekeepy, right?
Mhm.
Hey, and Doree had a follow-on to Larry's question about the testing across the board, not just with content. Did you also test these things with a diverse set of participants?
So the only testing I can speak to, I guess, again, is just that term. And I would have to look at what we did when it came to demographic and age. And I know that we just focused it mainly on like small business owners because that's who was going to buy that product. But I do think that that's a very valid point. And again, it goes back to having, people with input need to have different lived experiences to make something as meaningful and less hurtful to everybody that's going to be, either trying to buy it or whatnot. So yeah.
I'll also add on to that as far as like when we were creating the principles, we got a ton of feedback from, again, I'm going to plug our employee resource groups because they're amazing. But we made sure that we kept them in the loop and made sure that we were incorporating their feedback. And we also worked with our HR team. There's a woman on our team named Charisse who was on the racial equity and advancement leadership team. And they were working with an outside consultancy, and she was able to like pass our guidance or our like thoughts or drafted stuff onto them to be like, hey, like, what do you guys think about this? Is this in line with like, what HR is teaching you? They're creating equity and diversion training or diversity training. And so we were able to get a lot of feedback that way too, from HR and from the consultancy and from our ERGs. So it's not like we just like went into a room and like created these by ourselves.
And I will say as one last note, I know that when we first shared the guidelines and the work is a constant state of iteration, but one of the first times that we shared this out, I know I got some feedback from interaction design partners as well as some of our design research partners about like, how can we start getting more diverse participants? That was actually something that came out of this work. So it's a work in progress, but we're definitely trying to make strides wherever we can.
Then we have a question from Kirsty Taylor. Have you been able to find or identify problematic terms from other cultures that might occur in your English content, even other English-dominated cultures like Australia or the UK that have different DEI issues?
That's a great question. We have not done that yet because right now we started small. So we started with US English. We started with replacing master admin and using that almost as like a pilot to see like, how long does this take? How do we do this? And then once we had a success story, we could take that to other teams. So that's why we've started doing it in desktop, which is a totally different product. But yeah, I think that's a great next step is seeing where that exists in other cultures. Because I know that I'm sure there are things that we haven't thought of. And like Jennifer said, like this is a constant iteration. It's not just a static page. So yeah, that's a great suggestion for where to go next.
Nice. And then Julie had a question. How do you balance between using other sources of inclusive language versus crafting what works for you? It seems that there are some pretty sweeping words to avoid lists out there. And was there an aspect of the words you wanted to use more of instead of just finding words to replace?
I'm going to have to scroll to find that question because there were a lot of different.
Yeah. I'll break it. Yeah, the first half of the
Okay.
question was yeah. No, it's a good point. How do you balance between using other sources of inclusive language versus crafting what works for you?
I think it started with that audit. Again, like it wasn't the in-depth audit, but just kind of seeing like, oh, like these are some words that we know are problematic. Like, do they exist in QuickBooks? Do they exist in TurboTax? And then seeing where, what, like, have customers mentioned this? Have employees mentioned this? And when we found out they did, we're like, okay, we're going to tackle that first.
How did you come up with that first list to run the audit, though?
Oh yeah. So the content UX Slack, I don't know if anyone here is a member, but it's a great, huge community of people, and there were people. We started an anti-racist language channel, and people were just talking. So it's from not just from tech, but higher ed. There were just so many different people, governments, talking about, these are the terms. And so we just had like crowdsourced a spreadsheet. And so that's kind of where we started, where there were just some terms that were thrown out. And so we were just looking like, hey, like, do these terms exist in our product?
Yeah. And then the flip side of the question was, are there words that you want to use more often?
Clear words.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing. It's not necessarily like, oh, we want to use a certain word more often. It's more like, here are some alternatives that are clearer if you have to use something. And that's more in like conversation, not necessarily the product. In the product, we want to replace the same word with a like word. But Nicole, did you want to add something?
No, I was just nodding my head because it's always back to just something that's meaningful and clear. And also to add on to how the list evolves, like people also contact us, when they see something or have questions about something that they feel uncomfortable about. And so again, I think it's still pretty community based, where we're not just siloed coming up with a list on our own, where we're just continuously trying to get people to participate and tell us what they think as well. So
yeah, that's a great point.
I was also going to add are there words we want to use more of? I feel like we did discuss that at one point. And, we're just focusing on one thing at a time. And since this is ever evolving, right now we're just focusing on the words we know we want to change and make more clear. But I think I do remember us discussing that at some point.
Well, actually, yeah, I think we kind of did, because that's how you came up with those questions about how, like, what to ask yourself. So Caitlin in her former life was a teacher, and she came up with this great idea of having questions to have people self-reflect, rather than like asking us like, hey, can I use this word? Can I use this word? Because we don't want to be the language police. We want to like instruct and empower people to create their own make their own decisions. And so we have those questions on our website too, of like, how do I know if a word is problematic? And I think that's ultimately where we landed, of like, we don't want to necessarily tell people what words to use more of, but more like give them the tools to make that decision for themselves.
Sorry, which link is that?
Oh, I'll pop it in the chat right now.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we had another question and Kirsty, how do you pronounce your name? Is it Kirsty or Kirsty? I've heard different people pronounce it different ways.
I pronounce it Kirsty, but Kirsty is fine. It's better than Christy.
Okay, thanks. So Kirsty asks, have your localization team worked with the translations to ensure that similar problematic terms don't occur in other locales? As in, or they've avoided problematic terms relevant to their own cultural context? It kind of related to that earlier question, I think, about.
It does relate to that earlier question. I wonder how Sarah answered my earlier question, and it sounds like you're probably not there yet, and that's a future thing maybe.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find the link to paste in the chat, so I'm reading your question right now. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I assume yes, because they have a pretty good relationship. but I don't have the answer to that.
Okay.
I hope so, because there are content designers in other regions too.
Yeah, it occurs to me that we're getting more people from around the world at this meetup. Maybe we should more proactively reach out so we can get crowdsource answers like that.
Yeah.
So I'm Carolyn. I have a background in localization, and I think just from my experience, different languages have their own kind of, might be different terms that have different meanings because of their different experiences. So I'm thinking in particular in Germany, there are certain words that have a loaded meaning. So I think it really would depend on each individual region. So that's just the way I feel about it.
And it's probably not just a multiplication of this problem, it's probably an exponential increase in issues, I'm going to guess, as you expand out.
Yeah, I think so. I think it may be something that is kind of a trend that's starting here in the United States, but maybe isn't quite as widespread as of a practice, but will be probably. But like I said, it just depends on, the different locales.
And Heidi had a question. Do you have any feedback to share around the use of words like trigger, which is ubiquitous and used commonly across multiple industries? And Heidi, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so my question about it is trigger has also at the same time during the pandemic become really popular, and also in political circles become popular. Of course, it's linked to guns. It really actually goes all the way back to World War I, where people were talking about trigger in terms of associating it with like PTSD and with trauma. But it's also used a lot, it's historically been used with automation. So I'm wondering if you encountered situations where it's also, maybe you can keep the term, but you have to be really careful about the language you use around the term. Like, I've encountered people who want to say like fire a trigger or shoot a trigger, like to kick off the trigger, kick off the automated action. But, I'm wondering, like, it's used across marketing, banking, automation, all these places. So you also ask yourself the question, like, are we potentially diluting, like, how do we deal with this and also speak to end users or users who are familiar with this term in their work from an automation standpoint? Any thoughts?
I think that's a really good question. And one thing that we came up with is the term acting metaphorically, or is it acting literally? Like you literally pull a trigger for a gun. And one term that came up for us was like dark mode versus dark UX. So dark UX refers to like deceptive practices in design, whereas dark mode will literally refer to it being dark, as in no light. So I think that's like the key point to think about there is like back to clarity, because not everyone understands metaphors, or people understand different metaphors and different idioms. So I think that goes back to, that's a good example of showcasing what we mean when we say clear language.
That was just like as you were saying that, my mind was just like, boom, boom, boom. That's really helpful.
Oh, awesome.
That's really, really logical, clear way to address a lot of issues that come up with like this word and other words like that. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And then I have one other question. Can I sneak one in, Larry?
Sure, go ahead. Quickly.
Okay, so has this also made you guys think of things like around, I think Intuit's done some stuff around when you enter your name into like the product and making that, you know, more like less hurtful and more equitable. And also I'm wondering if you've provided feedback on how to tell more equitable stories. You know, and get away from, you know, including language, visuals, scenarios, things like that.
For the first part about names, one of our colleagues, Vidika Bansal, did a great talk at Button about names and inclusive language. And we have that as a pattern in our field level error messages. And I posted the link in the chat. But basically at the bottom, it says, you know, names are never wrong. Names are important. We don't want to invalidate anyone by flagging their name as an error in a field. So, you know, we don't blame or shame the customer with error messages like your name is invalid. We focus on the system error. So that's an answer to the first question potentially. And then I forgot what the second one was. It was about stories.
Was it about representation, like in our products and in marketing?
Yeah.
And I think that's an excellent question, because I work in brand and marketing, but that doesn't necessarily mean brand. We partner with brand. So I would say content design and visual design push brand all the time to, you know, create campaigns and photo shoots and interview real customers and people with different lived experiences. And I think that's just starting to evolve in a different way right now. But it's really, I feel like it always kind of lands back on XD to be like, this is super important. Our customers don't look one way. Our customers don't have the same types of businesses, and just to keep like evolving what that looks and feels like, because at the end of the day, like that's who they are. So that's a work in progress, but I think that's a super valid point, and I hope we get to a better spot.
And Ko, and if I'm mispronouncing your name, please unmute and let me know. Asks, are you willing to share the Slackbot resource? And also, how about working with a larger organization like LinkedIn to help some of this work scale?
Oh, I love that. If anyone works at LinkedIn, hit me up.
I actually work there. and one of my colleagues was here earlier.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I think that would be great. So the Slackbot was built internally, and because we partnered with Writer, who's, you know, we like pay for their license. It's not necessarily a public code, or, you know, we had, I don't even know, our engineers like use their API and like built a little bot. So I would love for it to be public someday. I'm still going to push for that. So we're working on it.
How does it compare with Writer? Are they like, they kind of do similar things, right? Using AI to identify, or some mechanism to identify troublesome language? And
yeah. So we were actually able to use our Writer API because it already flags inclusive language. So we were able to like use their API to build our bot and use their, we manage terms in their term bank, and we were able to like use our term bank to flag language. So it was definitely like a quick pilot. Like I think we built it in like 3 weeks. But I'm definitely hoping that we can put more time and money and effort into it and create something that's a little more broader in scope. So stay tuned.
Hey, and this isn't phrased as a question, but I want to read what Bridget shared. When people get defensive, I share stories others have told me about times when language made them feel excluded. One of my colleagues mentioned how when people say things like, I'm so busy I could kill myself, I brought up extremely painful memories about her brother who had died by suicide. So that's, yeah, any thoughts on that?
I think that's really powerful. I love that. And it's yeah, it also creates empathy. Empathy is a huge thing that we are always trying to make sure is front and center. It's not just like, we always think about our lived experiences, but we need to make sure that we're keeping others in mind as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Bridget.
And I think if anybody else, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Slack or in the chat. Sorry, we're all in Slack. But if anybody wants to unmute, if you have anything last, we want to make sure we get everybody's questions addressed. You know, I'd love to ask you all about, I recently came across the term amok, like running amok, has a really interesting etymology, which is troublesome for some people. And so I've kind of quit using it. Curious if you all have thoughts about that, like words that are, it seems like there's some words that are really deeply entrenched in our language. And it'll be really hard, like trying to get guys out of your plural vocabulary, that kind of thing. Any thoughts on that kind of language?
I mean,
go ahead, Caitlin. You got.
I was going to say we've tried to stop saying stuff like guys too, but it takes practice, I guess. So I wouldn't say we have like, I guess when you are more descriptive and try to be inclusive, it can never be a bad thing. You know, if you want to say everyone or people, we call each other people doodles, things like that. There's always something better than just guys.
Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead, Julie.
Julie, yeah, go ahead.
The challenge that I have whenever we talk about this is I want to go so many places. You know, like we talk about inclusivity and we talk about words to remove, and even Nicole, I heard you make the phrase, you know, killing two birds with one stone. Ever since a yoga instructor years ago told me her peaceful alternative was feeding two birds with one scone, I think about even stuff like that, because I mean, that's violent. And for people who love nature and feel very connected to that, hearing something like that can, you know, and the story behind where that phrase even came from was literally in New England. They used to have these days where whoever bagged the most birds, and they didn't do anything with them, they just went out and shot birds. So I have all of these different places things go. How did you guys keep reining each other in to be able to start somewhere and grow it? Like, how did you manage keeping it manageable?
I think, Caitlin, you look like you want to say something.
We asked ourselves the same thing, and it's just a matter of having discussion about priority, harmfulness, talking to others, and just using our best judgment. We don't really know the answers, but.
Well, I would also add that it can feel really overwhelming when you think of like, there are so many words and so many things that we want to change. Like it can feel almost like freezing. Like, how do I even get started? There's so much. And so we really narrowing our scope really helped us. Like when I showed that spreadsheet, like break it down into bite-sized chunks and be like, okay, we're starting with just anti-Black language. And then we can expand from there. Once we have like this little thing, we know how to do it. We've talked to people, we can keep expanding and go from there. That really helped us keep the project manageable and be able to make progress. So I would say start small and know that you can't boil the ocean. You just have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I'll also say, I'm glad that you brought this up, because there are so many things that I think I've said in my life, and we've all said in our life, that you've learned about because you have open conversations. It's such an important part of this whole process. So, you know, there's so many terms that are even on our word list now that I didn't have context for until 6 months ago. And so I'm hoping like this kind of work is just this evolution of self and of content and of everything else. So I think that's a really great example of like speaking about it, and then, being like gaining your own self-awareness, and then having these conversations with others.
It seems like you guys also built confidence through this process, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to add one more thing. Larry, you had mentioned like running amok. And I'm bringing it back to the questions again that we have, which is like, does the language make you uncomfortable even if you can't quite articulate the reason? And I now find myself questioning a lot of things like, why do we say that? Like, that's just part of my language now, but like that makes me feel icky and I'm not really sure why. And so then I will usually like try to do some research and then just try to do better.
Yeah. I'm curious too, if you're seeing, I have to wonder if there's some generational aspect to some of this as well, whether, a lot of these terms came into use because, 20 years or 30 years ago, the demographics of people doing the writing and the coding and so on were, tended to be fairly, limited or whatever. And I don't know that I really have a question here, but I'm kind of curious, if you've seen anything that would sort of support both from kind of internally and from your customers, whether, you're seeing kind of a generational shift or anything away from, and more, obviously just more openness to this as a topic and versus people saying, oh, come on, we've always said it that way or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's also just been more openness to change and realizing that, I have a linguistic background and there's like language is not stagnant. It is always changing. It is always evolving. And so there are always going to be people who want to like hold tightly to the language that they've always known, but they're not realizing that, like 25 years ago, Google was not a verb. And now it's something that we say all the time. And they are like TikToking or a TikToker, like, all these different phrases that enter our lexicon every single day. Language is always changing. And before you know it, like 5 or 10 years have gone by, and hopefully a lot of these words will have been eradicated from everyday language and we've substituted them for something clearer and more inclusive.
Yeah, I'm wondering if any of you know, is there like a central clearinghouse for this kind of information, like the way Sarah Richards is with plain language? Is there anybody that you're aware of who's working on this?
Not that I know of. I just have a bunch of links bookmarked.
It sounds like the content, the design, what is it, UX and content, anyhow, that Just Sans Slack, that channel there sounds like one place.
Yeah, there are. And they also have an Airtable with a ton of resources there. And they have one about inclusive language too, I think. So that's a good place to get started if you don't know where to start.
Well, good. Well, if there's no more questions, Paula, do you want to wrap it up, or did you have anything last? Or
I don't have any other questions or comments other than thank you so much, Sarah and Nicole and Caitlin and Jennifer. There's been some great feedback and conversation going on in the chat, which is great. Thanks for all the resources you've shared. Just a quick reminder, I dropped it in there again too, but join us on our Slack channel if you can. I know everybody is a bit overwhelmed with Slack channels, but it does give us a place to kind of do things like share slides and share recordings and stuff after the event. So feel free to join us there. And this has been a really terrific event, and thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you
so much.
Have a great night.
Good night.
Thank you so much.